Okay, guys, we're going to talk about chapter 13, Siena and Florence. Um, and we're talking about these cities in particular for an entire chapter um, because of the impact that they had during this time period on Western culture. Um, the course is a survey of Western humanities, and so while we do get some Eastern, um, I, let's face it, the book does not cover as much as it probably should in a lot of ways. But this is our chapter. So during this time, there was a conflict between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, and there was mutual pressure a lot of times both ways for a particular pope to be appointed. A lot of times the emperor had a lot of say in that, and the popes would occasionally push back on politics within the empire. And this goes back to Charlemagne that we talked about in chapter 10. Um, you have the Guelphs, okay, and these are, think of them as factions, like political parties, though not in our modern sense of the political parties, more like factions of people. And the Guelphs supported the Pope traditionally within these conflicts. Um, and then you had the Ghibellines, who sided with the emperor. And Siena was a Ghibelline city, siding with the emperor, whereas Florence was more with the Guelphs. Um, and so, one of the things that we see here, um, the Pope, uh, the Pope had a lot of power over papal banking as far as where the money of the church went. And originally, the church's money was in Siena, and the bankers of Siena managed those funds. Well, since Siena ended up siding largely with the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope revoked that, moved the money to Florence, and in the long run, Florence is the city that probably ended up as the more powerful and influential city in the long run. Um, Florence bankers, they invented checking. As we think of modern checking, they formed the basis of that. They formed the basis for what we would think of as our modern credit system. They formed the background for insurance, if for life insurance. If somebody was off, especially if when we're thinking about merchant classes, merchants would go on long trips, and they would buy insurance from the bankers of Florence. And so the Florentine banking system was very creative, very innovative, for coming up with really the foundation for what we think of as modern banking. Um, they also introduced the first singular currency that was accepted really throughout all of Europe, um, the gold florin. Um, and it's really kind of was when Europe was looking at forming the euro, they looked all the way back to the florin in a lot of ways for inspiration for how that would work. Well, by 1422, there were about 2 million florins throughout Europe, and considering that a family could live well on about 150 florins a year, and realize that the population back then was nowhere close to what it is now. That's a, a lot of money being backed by the Florence bankers. Um, you could build a palace for 1,000 florins. Okay, I mean a comfortable palace. Uh, so the fact that they had 2 million of these in circulation was really a tribute to the bankers of Florence. Um, Florence was originally a free commune governed by guilds. Okay, so when we think of guilds, think of you'd have like the stonemasons guild, and you'd have the butchers guild, the various professions, bankers, uh, masons, etc. Um, there were 7 major guilds and 14 minor ones in Florence, most prestigious being the Lawyers Guild, then the Wool, Silk, Cloth. And then You would also have among the major guilds were the bankers, doctors, and other merchant classes. Um, Things such as butchers, bakers were more the smaller, less influential guilds. Um, and the merchants really controlled the government, even though that there was nobility. But the merchants in this commune system really controlled it. Um, and they were known as the popolo grasso, which literally means the fat people, as opposed to the popolo minuto, or the ordinary workers. Um, and the ordinary workers comprised about 75% of the population and really had no say over their own government. Um, in order to serve as part of the government, and only guild members could serve as part of the government, um, 9 names were drawn every 2 months from a bag. Okay, and those 9 people would essentially run things for the next 60 days. Well, that's all well and good. It seems random, but you know, it was pretty easy to shape the paper or give it some kind of a texture so that people knew who to draw out. And so, and the other thing that influenced this is the guilds basically all had the same interests. So even though you were getting different people, they were all trying to do the same damn thing. So nothing changed, which was the whole point of changing people, is that you're supposed to get different viewpoints. Um, in Florence, the Guelphs were typically merchants, and the Ghibellines were the nobility, um, which kind of set these two groups, the merchants who were supporters of the Pope, against the Ghibellines who were supporters of the Empire. Uh, you know, they and I mean, this would spill over into street warfare sometimes. Different factions fighting against each other in brawls in the streets. Um, so that there this created long-term tensions that would eventually we'll talk about. Um, okay, Siena. Siena started off as really kind of a small village under Augustus Caesar in about 13, like literally 13 BCE. Um, it was kind of a Frankish town, Lombard and Frankish feudal counts, um, and they had a lot. They had serfs. I mean, typical Etruscan village of the time. Um, but wealth takes over, and eventually the loyalty of the common people moved from the nobility to the wealthier merchants of the city. Um, the advantage that Siena had is that as you think of people coming to Rome, okay, in order to get to Rome, because remember, Rome is on the boot of Italy, right? So you've got, if you look there on page 453, the only way to get to Rome, you had to go through Siena, and Siena was the last stop, which means that people coming from every direction, they may or may not go through some of these other towns, but if you're going to Rome, you're going to Siena, and it's near the end of the journey. And so Siena, when you think of there being about 200,000 pilgrims in Rome, okay, pilgrims, not the pilgrims that settled America, but people who were traveling to Rome to see it. About 200,000 in Rome at any given time, and all of them had to come through Siena. So Siena brought in money from all over Europe, from these people that were traveling to see Rome. Siena was divided into 3 districts. It was settled on 3 different hills, and so they divided themselves into 3 districts according to those neighborhoods, right? And there was a representative on a council from each neighborhood. So they were divided that way. There was also some class divisions. The wealthiest Sienese nobles, or the grandi, or great ones, looked over this, had smaller neighborhoods, and then the clergy had a bishop, headed by a bishop, and then you had local uh, monasteries, etc., that reported up that way. So uh, the other thing, the common people had a military that they self-organized, and so they were able to call up this citizen militia on short notice, um, and also granted autonomy to the city because the people were the fighters as well. Um, the guilds became a very powerful force, just as in Florence. The Merchants Guild was the most powerful in Siena, um, and the wealthiest merchant families lent money, and they did it charging interest, which is called usury, URSURY, usury, which is a practice that was supposedly forbidden, but they kind of had a wink-nod deal where they did it anyway. Um, by 1280, the Merchants Guild pretty much controlled the government completely, excluding the nobility, and only merchants would be eligible to serve on the city council. Um, so, obviously, over time, other guilds and the commoners began to resent the merchant guild's influence, and in 1355, they forced the resignation of the council and the merchants guild, and anyone belonging to a guild was technically able to serve. But pretty much what happened at that point is the next most powerful guild took over, the shopkeepers and notaries. So by 1368, there were 4 revolutions against government in 4 months, and the system started crumbling. Um, okay. Both Siena and Florence claimed the Virgin Mary as their protector, and so there was this competition between the two to see who could paint the Virgin Mary the best. And what we see again is this return to a more naturalistic style that we saw in the classical Greek era. And whereas if we look at the Greeks, where they excelled in naturalism was really in their sculpture, whereas during this period we start to see it in painting, sculpture as well. But the painting techniques, just the ability to make paint that would last, was something that was not available during the classical period to the same extent. Um, so if we look, for example, at the figure of St. Catherine's Monastery, right, the Byzantine image in chapter 8, right, not a very naturalistic one, but we look, for example, there on page 456, it looks like an actual baby, right, and we see, like, we can see, for example, Mary's knee being represented to where we actually see her form as part of what's going on, as opposed to simply a less realistic impression. Um, Mary really becomes a model for human behavior. Um, she's held up, she is sanctified. This is how we are supposed to behave. This is who we are supposed to be like, especially women. And we end up again with this dichotomy between wanting the virgin but also wanting access to the body that pervades and really has created a lot of problems throughout the centuries in sexual relationships, the virgin whore dichotomy. Um, and a lot of that starts during this period where Mary is held up as this ideal, perfect virgin. One of the ways we know that Mary is better than everybody is because she's bigger. They make her bigger. If we look there again on 456 at the people around her, she is substantially larger than other people. If we look for also on 457 at Simone Martini image, right, we can really see her skin. It has color, it has tone. It looks like the actual tone, the tones of flesh, right? Trying to capture that the naturalism, right? that you can see blood in her cheeks, right? You can see it flush. Um, so this is kind of a move back to naturalism as expressed through painting. Um, Going on to Cimabue and Giotto, uh, we see the Cimabue actually trained Giotto, okay? And so whereas you can look on the left and see the master's work, you see on 459 him being outstripped in naturalism by his student, okay? Um, and he was able to just capture so much emotion, so much character, so much personality, to where we really feel like this is a living being. Um, there's a movement away from stock characters during this time as well, to where we've seen in the past, right, a representation of a type repeated over and over again. Characters have individuality. You look there on 459 at the various people around Mary. During the Byzantine era, they all would have looked basically exactly the same. And each one of these people has their own look, their own appearance that is slightly or greatly different in many cases, right? All right. And then just really quick on 462, the idea of tempera painting, which is a medium where you use pigments in a paste, and then you use water and egg yolk to create the paint, which is a very difficult process because it dries so fast. And so you've got to be making it, mixing it, and turning around and using it quickly. So it really takes a master of the art in order to pull this off. All right, let's talk about Dante's Divine Comedy. Okay, um, this po- giant poem across three books follows a Christian soul from purgatory to salvation, or from hell to purgatory to salvation. So you have Dante's Inferno, Dante's Purgatorio, and Dante's Paradiso. Okay, so this is the journey from hell, right, Inferno, to purgatory, Purgatorio, and to heaven, Paradiso. And Dante is the leading character. He's the main character in his own book, and he's led by Virgil. Okay, and we talked about Virgil, I believe, when we talked about the Romans. Um, and Virgil cannot lead Dante actually to heaven because he's a pagan. So even though he's a great person, he's not going to get into heaven because he doesn't know Christ. Um, so he is essentially condemned to limbo, which is the first level of hell. So it's a place of sorrow, but not torture. All right. So this is the difference with limbo. This is philosophers, great virtuous pagans, philosophers, unbaptized children, great authors, others who are unsuitable for heaven, but still they're not that bad, right? Um, so Dante was a Guelph, but the Guelphs at this point were so divided into the blacks and the whites, which is papal families versus imperial-leaning families. And Dante was, in fact, even though he was a Guelph, which is used to back the papacy, he's part of the subfaction that actually kind of more backed the imperial families. And when the blacks took power, he was exiled for a couple years. And if he was to return to Florence without paying his fine for being a white, then he would be executed. And since he couldn't pay the fine, he was never able to return home. So the Inferno is nine. If you've heard of the 9 circles of hell, this is from Dante. Okay, and so he first encounters Paolo and Francesca, whose unclean love for each other. they're confined to touch each other but never consummate their feelings. Okay, so first first layer of hell. Next ring are the gluttonous, and so the gluttonous have to live like pigs in their own excrement, so living in shit. Um, Sinners are not punished for their sins, and this is important. They're not punished for their sins, but rather by their sins. Their actual sins punish them. So the lovers, illicit love, so they have to be right there next to each other, touching, but they can never really come together. The gluttonous, you eat and eat and eat, and so when you eat, you shit, and so they are condemned to live in their shit. Um, so the next level is that of flatterers, hypocrites, and liars, and then violent sinners further down, immersed for eternity in boiling blood, and then uh, at the bottom of the pit are traitors. Uh, so the Guelphs and Ghibellines from all over Tuscany who did not take care of their cities like they were supposed to. And then finally, Satan at the very lowest level, literally chewing on the worst of all traitors, Judas, who betrayed Christ, and Brutus and Cassius, who betrayed Julius Caesar. Um, so the rhyme scheme is a terra rinza, which is a three-line pattern that goes ABA, BCB, CDC, etc., 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 all the way through, which is a really wonderfully complex and beautiful pattern to hear, right? Because it just keeps playing off of these various rhymes all the way through. Um, it really plays off of the number 3, right? Um, so Satan has 3 heads, 3 consummate sinners that he chews on, 3-line stanza. Each of the 3 books has 33 cantos, plus an introductory. So there's 100 for perfection. 9 circles of hell, 3 times 3, and 9 circles of penitence in purgatory, and then of course the 9 spheres of heaven, so the heavenly spheres, right? Dante's guide through paradise is Beatrice, the love of his life. When Beatrice was in a marriage at 18 that she was arranged when she was 8 with Simone de Bardi, the marriage only lasted for 7 years because she died. And Dante, of course, then has this classic unrequited love. He loved her, she was perfect, he couldn't have her, and then his frail dove perished, and so it was never to be, which from, this kind of chivalric love makes it ideal. All right, the Black Death. Let's talk about plague. Why not? So in 1316 and 1317, shortly before Dante himself died, there was the greatest famine the continent had ever seen. There was almost no sun for 2 years, which means things died. And the reason that there was almost no sun, before I get to that, leading up to that, for the previous 300 years, between 1000 and 1300, the population of Europe had almost doubled in a 300-year time period, which means that food resources were already pushed beyond really its ability to sustain itself. And so there was a cooling period, too much rain to allow for good grain harvest, common people were starving, and then we have a volcanic eruption. Now, the volcanic eruption was in Indonesia, okay? It was nowhere close to Europe, but it was a massive one, massive, spewing ash into the air, okay? And this ash covered the entire planet. There was so much, and literally blocked the sun. And so you have this 2-year period where life in Europe was almost unsustainable, and this weakened the entire generation. And then 1347. 1347. So we have this generation of people that's starving, that's weak, right? And then the Black Plague hits. So the Black Plague hits. There's a town on the Black Sea, Kaffa, had been under control of the Huns, who were trying to take control of the trade routes, okay, around the Black Sea. And the plague was probably carried there by rats from China. It originally started in China, taken over to Europe. The Chinese, though, had better hygiene, and so though it hit, it didn't hit as hard as it did in Europe, and they didn't have the sustained bouts again because they were just cleaner people. Okay, Europe was filthy. Europe was filthy, and so the people who were attempting to take Kaffa would actually take dead bodies who had died of the plague and hurl the dead bodies into the city in an attempt to infect the population so they could take it easier. Which is kind of like burning down a house and then saying, then once the people leave and they're dead, you're like, hey, I have a house, but it's burnt down. So they really didn't think this through very well. So these 4 ships came back from Kaffa. They thought that they were fine. They weren't. They had the Black Plague on. And the plague can be transmitted in multiple ways. The main way that it's transmitted is by fleas on rats. Okay? This is how the population gets it. But it can also be spread person to person, absolutely. And the Black Plague works by, it begins in the lymph glands of either the armpit or the groin area, and it fills up with pus. It's gross. It's disgusting. And it looks black. Okay? So it's called the bubonic plague because these marks, right, on the armpit and the groin are called buboes. And they're black, and so it's also called the Black Death. And rodents were everywhere. I mean, even in the wealthiest of households, you were going to have rats. Because they just didn't have an effective way of keeping them out. You try to keep cats to prevent it, but ironically, the problem that they ran into with that is the cats could also catch the fleas. And so they tried killing all of the cats to prevent the cats from carrying it around. But the cats were what was killing the rats that had it. The rats had it worse than the cats did. So they literally were killing off one of their best weapons, cats and small dogs, actually, such as terriers. Terriers, dachshunds, these small dogs were actually a lot of times used to kill off rat populations. By 1350, except for a very few territories, all of Europe had been subjected to the Black Death. Tuscany lost 60% of its population. In Florence, 1,800 people died in one day on their feast day, and then the next day they lost another 1,800. So about 4% of the city's population died in 2 days alone. So it's just absolutely devastating. We look at one of the differences if we look at our own, because I actually just talked about a book called Journal of the Plague Year in my advanced comp class, looking at the effects of the plague on England. And one of the main differences between that and COVID, because we're fighting a plague right now, essentially. Okay, we're fighting a disease. The Black Plague killed a very high percentage of the people that it infected. But the advantage to that being is it showed itself quickly, and so people were isolated. They were literally locked in their houses. There were watchmen set over any house that had it, and the people were boarded in and not allowed to leave, and the watchmen could do pretty much anything they needed to keep them in there. COVID does not kill as high a percentage of the people, but it infects more people. It moves faster, and it moves more silently. With the Black Death, you typically knew in the most at 48 to 72 hours if somebody had it, and they were going down fast. COVID, you might not know if somebody has it for 2 weeks, and in that 2 weeks they're spreading it. Black Death, there's very clear markers quickly, allowing people to isolate. And I want to also talk about the concept of quarantine, because people currently are arguing that, well, quarantine is for the sick. That's not true. Actually, the word quarantine comes from quarren, right, which meant 40, tine, meaning days. Okay, so when a ship came into port during this time, the whole ship, even if they didn't have a single person on board, or thought they didn't have a single person on board that had it, was required to stay in harbor without anybody, or actually not even in harbor. They had to dock, or they had to drop anchor in the harbor, and they could not leave for 40 days until that allowed the city to know that there was nobody on board who was infected. Okay, so even back then, you keep people isolated in order to keep everybody safe. You do not allow people who are sick out of the house. If somebody was sick, their whole family was boarded up with them, and those people weren't allowed to leave. They were brought what they needed. The government provided funds in order to make sure that the sick had what they needed, but they did not risk those people infecting anybody else. Now, one of the things that happened out of this is there were people. It seized the imagination of people. They're being punished by God. God is clearly angry with Europe at this time in people's minds, and so you had flagellants who would go from town to town whipping themselves. There was also violent anti-Semitism. Okay, hatred of Jews that broke out. Remember we talked about the Jewish population in Spain, and there were horrible things that happened all across Europe to Jews. In Basel, in what we now know as Germany, a number of Jews were burned. The St. Valentine's Day massacre, almost 1,900 Jews were burned alive. And the fact that Jews were actually quite good at lending money, right? People saw this as a way not only, well, God must hate them, the Jews killed Christ, but also, hey, if they're dead, we don't have to pay our debts back. And so they were literally killing the people they owed money to. So this was in their minds, a win-win, right? And it's really a horrible thing. All right, let's talk about some more literature. The Decameron, the work of 10 days, written by Boccaccio. We talked about the frame tale in the past, right? I believe we talked about that in this class. This idea of writing a story, okay? You tell a story, and the people within that story tell other stories. And this is what happened in the Decameron. The Decameron, Deca, right, 10, was written in the same manner, like the Arabian Nights. We talked about frame tales in Arabian Nights when we talked about the Arabian Nights and Scheherazade. And so he had these people leaving town, right? And as they left town to escape the plague, a social order is really breaking down, okay? And social order really did break down during this time. This group is that they will gather together and each one's going to tell a story to each other, okay? And so you have these 10 people telling 10 stories over 10 days each, so for 100 total stories. And this story, reflecting the breakdown of society, Boccaccio pushed social convention to the limits in a lot of cases. Much as society was falling apart, he kind of had his characters reflecting that in their attitudes towards things such as sexuality. But it also really reflected daily life in a way that probably nobody quite had before. One of Boccaccio's best friends, Francisco Petrarca, better known as Petrarch, created the Petrarchian sonnet, which one of two forms of sonnet that we really focus on now. The other one being the Shakespearean sonnet, which was invented by Henry Howard. Yes, distant relative. Um, and but the Petrarchian sonnet really lends itself more to the Italian, whereas the Shakespearean sonnet, created by Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, lent itself a little bit better to English. Um, Boccaccio had originally argued that what Dante had done, because Dante wrote in Italian, okay, um, as opposed to in Latin, and the scholarly work was supposed to still be written in Latin at this time, and Boccaccio felt that uh, Dante had elevated Italian in the way that Homer had Latin, and Petrarch pushed back against that, arguing that things needed to be written in Latin, that it was holy, etc., and eventually got Dante to go back on that. Now, uh, let's talk about another great work of the time, and this is the Canterbury Tales. And if you ever get a chance to read the Canterbury Tales, oh, I strongly encourage you to do so. The Canterbury Tales are one of the greatest works in the English language. Chaucer is a scoundrel. His characters are incredibly well developed. Also a frame tale. But with Chaucer, his characters, rather than leaving a plague-ridden city, are on a journey to Canterbury. Okay, we talked about pilgrimages to Rome. They were taking a pilgrimage to the church at Canterbury. And in doing so, they decided to have a storytelling contest. And he was originally planning to write 120 of these little stories, with each of the characters telling a certain amount. He died, and so he never had a chance to finish it. He only got 22 stories down, with parts of a couple others. But his stories are so rich and so vibrant, and they reflect the society of the time in such a unique way. So you have the frame, right? The characters on the road to Canterbury, and you get to know them and who they are. But then they tell stories to each other, and so you get more and come to a better understanding of them. And their stories are often attacks at other members of the party. So, for example, you have a pardoner, right? And somebody's like, "Oh, I know a story about a pardoner," and then they tell this story that shows how pardoners are corrupt as an attack at that person. He creates personality in ways that really, I don't know if any author in any language had before him. And I realize that's a little Anglo-centric, but his vividness and his depth of character was really unique for the time. His characters weren't types, they were individuals, while representing types, which is really amazing. Um, Chaucer's characters come from all three estates or social ranks of the time, which is the nobility, the clergy, and the common people. And this is one of the other things that he did so well, is he brought social classes together and showed the interaction of the larger social classes as represented by the individuals. English is going through a change at this point. Okay, we talked about the invasion of England in 1066 by the Normans. Okay, and Normans spoke French, but their kids, right, were raised by commoners. Okay, where do we know this story? So the Angles and the Saxons were the ones raising the children of the Normans. Okay, and so they taught them their version of English. And so you end up with this blend of English and French, to which evolved into Middle English from Old English. Um, and in 1385, about the time that Chaucer started writing the Canterbury Tales, there was a decree, okay, that said that all court cases will be argued and verdicts rendered in English. And this was huge because this made English the legal language of the land. And because there was debate before that. And no, it's called England, but the Normans, remember the Normans were ruling. But as the generation after generation of Norman king was raised, by essentially English nannies, their language changed. They became anglicized. There became a blending of the two cultures at court, and English ended up winning out, although it was a different type of English. It was Middle English. Women at the time. The cult of the Virgin, the Virgin Mary, right, had a big influence on the way women were thought of, the way women were treated. They were supposed to be pure. They were supposed to be virginal until they weren't. And this had a huge influence. Women were actually very active in all guilds. They could go to school. They could learn to read the vernacular, not necessarily Latin, and usually not Latin. But even though they did all the jobs that men did, just like now, they got paid about 25% less. So now, there's by no means could you describe either Chaucer or Boccaccio as a feminist, but they did have strong women. They had interesting women. They had women of power. Boccaccio had Philippa, who was accused in her hometown. This is in one of the stories of committing adultery, and rather than denying it, she's like, "Yeah, because I got a lot of love to go around. My husband might be complaining that I'm sleeping with somebody else, but he's always satisfied and he's always happy with what I give him. And so, if I got some left over, why am I hurting anybody by, giving a little more loving when he's happy with what I'm giving him?" And she was supposed to be sentenced to death, and the court's actually like, she's got a point. And she ended up winning her court case. Chaucer's wife of Bath married multiple times to older men, outlived them all, got their estates. I think she had like 6 husbands, and raring to go for the next one, right? She's left every husband happy. She kind of jokes basically almost that she basically fucked her husbands to death. I mean, so they have these women who are powerful in their own right and are articulate and are thoughtful. The wife of Bath, the way she speaks is very witty and smart. She's no dumb bunny. Same with Philippa. Okay? So, though we can't say that they are feminists, they certainly create interesting and strong female characters. Christine de Pizan, on the other hand, was a writer at the time. Married 3 kids, husband dies, and so she has to raise her children. And so she became the first female professional writer in European history. And her writing is incredibly sharp. If you ever want to read The City of Women, it is just this amazing, amazing text where she goes, "Oh, I'm just a poor woman and I don't know any better. How could I know these things except..." And then she flips on it, right? And she just tears into people who attack women for being weak, etc. The City of Women, fantastic work. Now, during this time, we have the 100 Years' War between England and France, been going on forever. France is basically about to lose, okay? The Dauphin, the heir apparent to the throne of France, has almost nothing he can do. When a 17-year-old peasant girl comes to him and says, "Hey, can I lead your armies? Because God told me to." And this is Joan of Arc. And the Dauphin's like, basically, what have I got to lose? I'm getting my ass kicked anyway. And there was a prophecy that a maid would lead the French to victory over the English. And so he's like, well, if she wants to be that, I guess. And sure enough, she had stunning victory after stunning victory, driving the English back out of France. Now, after all that, the Burgundy French, the English were prepared to counterattack. And the English basically said, we won't come back at you if you give us her. And the Burgundy French betrayed Joan, and she was burned at the stake for cross-dressing. Literally, that's what they condemned her to death for, was for dressing like a man, because that's forbidden in the Bible. So Joan really serves as a representation of both the power and the perilous position of women at this time. Okay, don't forget to get your discussion boards done. Have a beautiful day, and I will talk to you next time.